We're rocking and rolling.
Hey
We're
everybody,
live.
Hello,
how
hello.
we hello, how we doing? Welcome, Just English Talk.
Welcome to another edition. We're doing something a little bit different today, aren't we, guys?
We are,
That's right. We're
um,
talking language today.
and we're in the
Going in on
audio
language.
sphere.
That's true.
hmm
Our faces cannot be detected, so you can't tell that I've just taken a bite of something apart from the difference in my voice.
Oh yeah, no, we can tell.
We
We
can
can
always tell.
tell. Yeah, yeah. People like that though. Again, it's all feeding into that massive growth in ASMR, where
This is
people,
very ASMR, isn't it?
for some reason, like hearing other people masticate,
Yes,
chew.
famously. Chew. Yeah. That's an
So what we're
interesting way
discussing
to
to
start, isn't it, actually?
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Strong
very kind of
start.
the
uh,
formal versus informal language topic is going to come
Mm.
up in today's discussion. So we're talking today about something which sounds really fancy, which is prescriptive linguistics. But in reality, it's just all about talking proper and writing right. Anyone want to build on what I've just said for what is prescriptivism as a concept?
Um, in my understanding, it's mostly just rules defining how language generally is used and how society has agreed that language could or should or will be used.
mm,
Um, and there are lots of different opinions about that, of course, as everyone comes from their own background about language and rules, and everyone has their own relationship to rules in general, not just with language.
Indeed. And so the prescriptive part of it is that there is a prescribed way of talking. It is something that which has been
hmm
given to you, a rule imposed upon you. Within prescriptivism, there is also we have prescriptions, what you're supposed to do, and proscriptions, and these are things you're supposed to avoid. And more often, when we're talking about grammar rules, it's about the latter, the things we're supposed to avoid, those proscriptions. So, what sorts
The
of
dreaded
examples
split
come up?
infinitive, for
There we go.
example.
Split infinitives is a great one, isn't it? So,
Mm.
Alex, what's a split infinitive?
uh, well, you put me on the spot here. Um, Well, I actually don't know. So why don't you tell me? Because
Hmm. Well, this is
I,
what's really interesting because it's not
yeah,
a valid rule, but it's one that
okay, right.
people are obsessed with. So, a split
Mm.
infinitive, if you take another language such as Spanish, their infinitive verbs are just one word. So, the verb to be, ser, S-E-R. In English, we have to be. So with all of our infinitive verbs, which are kind of these basic forms of a verb before we've conjugated them or put them into tenses or aspects, um, they have a to in front of them. And because it's supposed to be one word, conceptually, like it is in many other languages, we're not supposed to split the to and the verb itself. So the famous example, or the most famous example, is to boldly go, right? We think
Mm.
about just the opening to, right, which nerd is going to help me out?
Is it Star Trek? To
It's
boldly
either
go.
Star Trek or Star Wars. It's one of those.
Yeah, it's Star Trek.
Star Trek. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's considered improper English.
Interestingly, though, that rule was only really sort of popularized in the 1800s. Um, and we're going to get, I think, a little bit more into how and why rules started to be applied in English. But interestingly, sort of this resurgence and then divergence from rules kind of happens in waves across,
Mm.
uh, due to a couple of different sort of introductions of technology and literacy, etc. But the fact that people tend not to split infinitives now, but then naturally people do as part of speaking freely.
Mm.
They
That
do.
that we sort of have an anxiety now about it that there used to be before.
Is
Yeah.
this a
And
case then of a tension between what's written and what is spoken?
I think so. I think it's certainly more heavily penalized in written language if you are to split your infinitives. Um,
Mm.
I noticed, Eleanor, when you said we tend not to split our infinitives, you didn't say we tend to not split our infinitives, which would be a split infinitive. So you are clearly acutely aware of it even when you are speaking. But most people, they abandon those kind of rules outside of the written formal word.
Mm.
And I think that's quite valid because written and spoken language are very different things, aren't they?
Well, you have more time with your written word, right? So there is an expectation that you do things quote unquote correctly.
Mm.
Whereas generally, and I mean, actually, podcasts are probably a bit of an odd one because we now there's such a high sort of there are so many people speaking now and recording themselves speaking and sharing those conversations that in that context they've become like permanent in a way that conversation probably hadn't always been,
Mm.
Mm.
right? If you think about the the early days of recording, what did we move to record as fast as we could? It was more things like music, right?
Yeah.
And sound than the kind of long form conversations. I guess eventually we moved into the world of speeches, and then if you think about early speeches, they follow the rules that they're supposed to, because once we realized, oh no, the words we're saying don't just disappear into the air anymore.
Mm.
They are being recorded and listened to and read and criticized.
And interestingly, this is kind of cemented in British schools because part of the expectation in exams is that you write with a formal register.
Yeah.
And if we think about the difference between speech and written language, often it is a difference between informal and formal language. And that's not to say that every conversation you have is informal, but there are certain expectations that you're meant to follow conventions if you're trying to write in a formal way. That I think a lot of these, that's where the sort of grey area becomes less grey, is when you're expected to speak in a formal way or write in a formal
Mm.
Yeah.
And what's quite interesting, I think, is that when we are being quite mindful of our language, even when speaking, and we're trying to be quite formal, if we were to generate a transcript from this conversation that we're having and attempted to read it back as if it were a piece of written prose, it would be almost impossible to follow because there would be so many false starts, there would be so many filler words, like that I just did then. It's all going to become very meta-linguistic as we notice the way that we're speaking. But it's fascinating because you'll look back at a piece of what you thought was incredibly articulate speech and you'll see it written down and transcribed and you'll go, wow, spoken language is incredibly different, even when you're attempting to be formal, even in fact when it has been pre-written like a speech. So this kind of boundary between spoken and written language is an interesting one. But people do still comment on and criticize your spoken language, even though you are supposed to have more freedom. It's also because it's inherently interactive. It invites more in the moment commentary, doesn't it, rather than the kind of the post hoc red pen on a piece of writing. In the moment, you'll have people going,
verbal red pen.
yeah, the verbal red pen comes out. And one of the most common ones that you see, or certainly that I have seen historically, is about fillers. And fillers are those words like
Like.
like is the most common one. That's where I was going with this. That's the kind of common teenage one that so many adults are desperate to pull out of you and insist is inaccurate.
And basically,
That's a good one.
and the new one.
So basically.
Yeah, so basically, yeah. And the other one that's very popular at the moment is I can't lie. I can't lie.
Yeah.
So much so that I believe his name's Asim Chowdhury, the comedian who was on People Just Do Nothing. If you check his Instagram, like the last almost a year of content is him clipping people saying, oh, I can't lie, I can't lie, and kind of basically mocking them. But I actually think it's quite an interesting linguistic tick that has
Well,
grown.
I'm suddenly just thinking of, the sort of semi-blasphemous ideas of that kind of from Shakespeare's time, that it's truth or
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that is really, this is almost you could see the linearity of that.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean,
So
if you break
expand
down
that
what,
one.
yeah, if you break that down, like, I can't lie, like I'm a man of
Mm-hmm.
or woman of
Mm.
my truth, and like
Mm.
I'm an individual who is of the utmost honesty
Yeah.
and
Mm.
pride.
And
Yeah.
another famous kind of, and it's more kind of regional, but particularly with kind of people who are Welsh or on the Welsh border. To be honest,
Oh yeah.
is a massively common kind of discourse marker slash filler, which loses a lot of its meaning.
Whilst you guys were speaking, I was kind of just poking around on the mark scheme for English language GCSE, and it's like
Yes.
it's very much there, right in the forefront. For
Mm.
example, to use standard English consistently.
Yeah.
And just because I was kind of being curious, I was like, well, do they define anywhere what that means? Um, and there's no like addendum or asterisk that says, just so you know, this is AQA's like definition of what that means.
Yeah.
So when you
And
type in
there never will
standard,
be.
yeah, and then of course, like when you type in standard English, like the only thing that I can see on Bite Size is saying like, oh well, it's a variety of English most easily understood by a wide audience, which is just a very
Mm.
It's
generic.
a cop out.
Yeah, it is a cop out, it
Because
seems.
to define standard English would take a long time. And what what is good about the mark scheme is that it doesn't say correct English, because they're not
Yeah.
the same thing. And what's good about bite size is that it says it's a variety. You could even recognize it as
Yeah, I think
a
that's powerful.
dialect.
Mm.
Um, but the best way would be to capitalize it, standard English with capital S, capital E, and then define it, which would
Mm.
take a long time, because so much of it is based on what we have generally
Mm.
accepted and we chat about. But where is the governing body? Where is the authority on what is standard English? And that's one of the questions I think is worth addressing in this conversation,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
Definitely.
Because where is it?
Right. And we know that in other languages, they have different sort of rule books or guidebooks or institutions that put out the list of standard French or standard Spanish, the expectations, the grammars, rules, all in one book so that you can find it. But for English, less so. There are
Mm.
more style guides like the Modern Language Association or the Chicago School, where students might see this because it's the way they've learned to cite sources, but
Hmm.
they don't necessarily realize that that is a guide for language in general within
Yeah.
English.
Most people are not looking beyond the, you know, how to cite,
Mm.
how to cite
Mm.
their sources, and most of them are not even going that far. If university essays are anything to go by, but kind of even beyond those are those specific institutions in-house style, and what they are doing there is really an extension of the only authority that we have in these areas, which are publication-based style guides. So if you want to
Hmm.
publish with us, you will need to follow our specific in-house rules. But as soon as you
Mm.
leave the building or you publish elsewhere, if it's writing, then there's a different set of rules, or indeed no formalized rules at all. And so it becomes this really nebulous, difficult thing to define what is standard English. And so
Mm.
we as English teachers, how do we go about this difficult duality, I suppose, where on the one hand we are teachers who are expected to teach standard English and enforce it in our marking and reinforce it for exam preparation, whilst at the same time recognizing that nobody's really defined it very well. Lots of the rules are bizarre and wrong, and we can come on to those in a minute. Um, and yet we have to be the teacher. So how do we resolve that difficulty?
Um, well, I would say like there's an age component. If we'll make I'll make an assumption and assume that the majority of students who will be listening to this will be kind of year 9 and above, maybe, just,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say that like there are some basics which should be adhered to because in your day-to-days going forward, your subjects, your future work, that kind of thing, if you don't do these things, you will stand out, and that can be as something as simple as a full stop and then a capital letter, in the
Hmm.
next line, right? Or the next word. So what do we do? Well, I guess we may forgive on the occasion, misused possessive s's, apostrophe s,
Mm.
because sometimes students can get a bit confused by those. But there are some kind of things, I think, that are, would you say, non-negotiable, when you're approaching the written word?
Yeah, I would say that a really good example is the use of full stops, i.e., sentence demarcation,
Yeah.
and a lot of the AO6. Obviously, different examples have different write-ups for their mark schemes, but for AO6, which is the kind of technical accuracy as a shorthand kind of heuristic, it will refer to sentence demarcation because it is so crucial. So the way that your
Hmm.
sentences start and end, and is it clear that they have started and ended? And I agree that it's non-negotiable both in terms of, something that we need to mark quite severely, but also
Mm.
in terms of the other aspect, which is communicative competence,
Yeah.
which is this concept whereby we recognize this makes sense. I know what is being said here, rather than this is adhering to this, you know, obscure set of rules. This makes
Mm.
sense, and that's really what grammar should be about. It is
Hmm.
making sense, i.e., creating sense and things being sensible. And sentence demarcation is crucial for that. So, if in doubt, stick in a full stop, guys.
Hmm.
And indeed, I think in as much as it seems like a silly rule, especially I noticed when students were in exam conditions, they were rushing and neglecting those things like full
Mm,
stops. Um, and it seems like such a silly thing for a teacher to pick up on, like literally minuscule thing
mm,
for a for a teacher to pick up on. But it really is a grammatical choice that shows that you have planned out a sentence and that
mm,
you view a sentence and you can see the construction of a sentence as meaningful and purposeful and as separate from a separate idea. So it's like those
hmm.
ideas of craft
Yeah,
are kind of finicky but are demarcated by these little symbols that make them have a separate meaning.
mm,
And I think it's really tricky in the last couple of years as texting and
Hmm.
messaging and everything like that has
yeah,
started to renegotiate things like punctuation, which are so critical in a piece of writing but are unnecessary even into work messages. They're
yeah,
not viewed as mandatory or even expected,
yeah.
as rather too formal in those formats.
Agreed. And I think that's the crucial thing. And I think that's why um, teachers, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, have had to be quite hard on written communication, much less
Mm.
so on spoken communication. And it's
Mm.
because, as Eleanor is saying, this idea of craft and a planned sentence, that's what used to make writing different from speech. But we have blurred the boundaries between writing and speech. And obviously, as you mentioned, the biggest way that we've done that is through what we call CMC, or computer mediated communication, which is texting. And instant messaging, particularly because instant messaging is supposed to replicate speech. And there's a linguist called John McWhorter, who talks about computer mediated communication and texting, and he refers to it as, forgive the expression, but fingered speech, which is this idea that you are just taking exactly how you would say things and using your fingers to communicate it. I hate that he's chosen that expression, but it's the one that has has come out of it. But
Yeah.
it's exactly why this has become so complex. Writing and speech used to be incredibly different, and when we differentiated between, sorry, when we blurred those boundaries originally, it was with, as you guys mentioned earlier, writing speeches where they were written to be spoken, but they were initially written. They were not spontaneous communication. Um, and now we have spontaneous communication, i.e., speech, being converted into the written form. And so this, I think, would be a not interesting or worthwhile time to introduce the concept of code switching, because I think it resolves lots of these difficulties. So, could either of you jump in and
Mm.
define code switching?
Yeah, so I guess that's adapting the way that you, in this case, we could talk about speak or communicate depending on the circumstances that you're in.
Mm,
And I think it's a really important one, for students and for people to think about in general. Like teachers, I often used to say to students, like, I'm not I have no issue with how you communicate
mm,
at all. But there's a time and a place for swearing. Like I would never shy away from the fact it's not like, I'm not an angel by any stretch of the imagination. But it wouldn't be appropriate for me to swear on this podcast. It
mm.
wouldn't be appropriate for me to swear in a job interview. It wouldn't be
Mm.
appropriate for me to swear, um, you know, I don't know, if I was going to visit the king, that kind of thing, right? It would be appropriate for me to swear in a football match,
Mm.
like in the stands, where
Mm.
that kind of thing is I guess part and parlance of the experience, or if I'd stubbed my toe and I was like in a lot of pain, and that's an example, isn't it? Like we adapt the way that we speak depending on where we are.
Mm.
Um, that's not to say that there's a hierarchy um of like acceptability. It's not like to suggest that one is better than the other.
Mm.
It's simply that as human beings, we've designed these circumstances, situations where we speak in certain ways.
Yeah.
So speak how you like to your friends in the playground. Absolutely go for it. Use, I'm not there. I don't care. Um, but
As long as you're being kind to one another, of course.
yeah, of course, and being respectful.
Yeah.
But in the classroom or eventually job interviews and these kind of scenarios and situations that young people will be finding themselves in, yeah, there is a certain mode, and that's, I guess, what we mean by code switching, adapting the way that you speak, depending on where you are. Eleanor?
Exactly that.
Yeah, I think I always give the example of students of you speak to your friends differently than you speak to your head teacher, your parents.
Hmm.
Both of them are right for the situation they're in, but it would be odd to swap those round, right? To say
Mm.
to your friends after the weekend, how do you do? Or something like that just sounds silly because it's not the right register. I will say, though, that when we start to think about those more formal types of, the professional type of speaking and the more formal types, that is where sort of the issues that I have around prescriptivism really lie, because the way that formal language or the sort of conventions of formal language and the conventions of professional talk all seem to stem from upper class,
Mm.
white, Eurocentric forms of language that are sort of part of the institutions that have enabled and continued classism and racism through them,
Mm,
because they're suggesting that standard, or if we were going to look back on mark schemes from 20 years ago, correct
Mm.
English would be those forms of upper class white language that
mm,
sort of complicates what we're talking about when we're talking about the expectations for students to code switch.
Mm.
mm,
What's really interesting about this is that kind of on top of the inherent bias that comes from that, because it is bias, there's also the kind of the flip side, which is that using standard English and indeed received pronunciation, which is this kind of so-called accentless way of talking out loud, it protects or hides your identity, and therefore everyone can present as on a level playing field. So if you are able to learn these conventions of standard English and receive pronunciation, there is this kind of sense of kind of social mobility and moving within and between these groups that are obviously where there is obviously a hierarchy.
mm,
Mm.
And so it's quite an interesting one where you can go, well, if I abandon my roots and my identity and speak the way that you speak, suddenly a lot of things become accessible, which is obviously an entirely
Mm.
unfair way of thinking about it. But just as a kind of tangent, it's related, but kind of very brief tangent. Eleanor, you spent a lot of time in the US in your life, and despite that, you have your kind of received pronunciation, or even somewhat elevated received pronunciation. But there are still hints of the American influence. So a minute ago, and I'm gonna point it out, the preposition that goes with different. So
Oh, different
Americans,
to, different from.
you said different than, which is acutely American. Um,
Ah,
Interesting. I hadn't noticed.
mm. And what's
damn.
really interesting there is um, you've exposed yourself as an American or or an analog to
Not
American.
exposed.
But I think that's really interesting because obviously you've refined and honed this way of speaking, but there are still ways in which identity pokes through. And so I think
Mhm.
talking about this idea of a personal identity coming through one's language, and how on the one hand that can be really important because this is who I am, this is my idiolect, which is your own personal way of speaking, or part of my sociolect, which is from the group of people I spend the most time with, or indeed my dialect, where I'm coming from more broadly. You kind of you identify with that group, but on the other hand, we have all of these ways that it pushes you out because of this kind of hegemonic um, power structure that we have in society based on language or reflected in the language.
Mm. Although I do think that a lot of this is like is changing because
Mm.
we are exposed so much more to different um, like ways of speaking and like particularly this is probably more specific, I guess, to kind of the inner cities and of Britain where there are more kind of cultures
Mm.
combining and speaking and doing what they want with English, as you should, because that's the best thing about language. It's like it's constantly changing and should be constantly evolving. Um, I just kind of think about the way that the things that young people consume, the ways of speaking that they listen to are becoming more and more the same type of stuff. Like before, I this is a kind of a slight tangent, but like I always remember growing up when I'd kind of go on holiday and we'd drive across Europe and you'd go from sort of like France into Germany, into Poland and these places. And
Mm.
it was very like the young people there were all very distinctive in like the way that they dressed and the kind of things that they were doing. Whereas now it's kind of like they all dress very much the same. They're all watching the same kind of TV. They're all consuming the same kind of artistic, um, often coming from Britain or from America,
Yeah.
right? Like, that's and it's almost like it's sort of we're sort of heading towards sort of one like big bowl of language that's like that
Homogenized.
everyone that's everyone's kind of drinking from and pouring back into like
Mm.
this kind of
Mm.
constant one of these like eternal stews in
Mm.
some respect. And I just think that's kind of uh fat, and it comes back to like we mentioned earlier, didn't we, this like so basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I heard that in the 3 London schools that I worked with, and when I went to work in Swindon, it was there too.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if I went up to Manchester or I went down into Cornwall, um, or I would possibly even go to some international school in British international school, I'm sure it would be there too,
Mm.
right? Because like that's what they're hearing when they open up their Instagrams and their TikToks and all this kind of thing. That's the sort of language that they're responding to.
Yeah.
And interestingly, as well, I've noticed students coming obviously from an American background to English parents and hearing a very specific kind of English at home,
Mm.
but not outside of the home sphere too much until I lived in England. Hearing English students who've not been to America, but often will pronounce things in an
Yeah,
Americanized way,
yeah.
Mm.
or use sort
Or they
of,
say things like blocks, like they're like, oh,
yeah,
like I'm gonna walk
blocks
up the
instead of
block, and I'm like, we
roads.
don't
Yeah.
in London. I was like, we don't have a block.
Yeah.
Like the city is not based on a grid system,
Yeah.
you know.
Right. But those things are sort of that slipperiness between English and American English.
Yeah.
Um,
But they're using it in
definitely
America
through
as well, in
media.
lots of English slang.
Oh, yes.
Mm.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's starting to come like into their parlance, and it's like mostly it's the kind of more crude terminology that like is pervaded in English kind of slang. But they're starting to pick those up and drop those in, and kind of yeah, it's quite fascinating.
Oh, absolutely
Mm.
fascinating. I always think of the example of the word beta. Most British people pronounce it beta, um,
Oh yeah.
because they've heard it in American. Actually, they mostly pronounce it beta, and they
Yeah.
soften that T as
Yeah,
well.
the
And
softy tea.
yeah, and so when you first hear it and you hear these kind of these English accents, and then the word beta coming through, and you're like, how am I spelling that? Oh, you mean beta, and you've only heard it in these American contexts, and obviously not in your kind of science contexts,
Mm.
Mm.
where it might be relevant, or indeed mathematical contexts. So that this kind of globalization of language, which has been helped both by TV and film, but also now the internet kind of massively increasing the speed and abundance of this spread. Um,
Mm.
but then what becomes interesting, I think, is whilst we have the so-called highest prestige way of speaking, which is the standard English and received pronunciation, even if you recognize that it has the most prestige, sometimes you will deliberately try not to speak that way because you are deliberately separating yourself from this kind of authority and the man and those with the power and the influence and the money, right? And you'll go, actually, I'm going to become further from that. I'm going to speak even more my type of English to
Mm.
remove myself from that. And the because we were talking about teenagers are the most obvious example where they have their own sociolects, and the way that text speak initially was developed, and you don't really use text speak anymore, but it was initially developed to fit a certain number of characters
Mm.
into a text message because you only had a certain number of characters in the text message, and so we
And each one
shortened
costs
words.
10p.
Yeah, each one costs 10p, exactly, or indeed 15p. About 25 years ago when we first started texting, um, and I remember thinking, well, I remember composing messages where I would spend, maybe 15 minutes just trying to fit everything that I wanted to say, so
Yeah.
I didn't spill over into another text and waste my credit because we weren't on contracts either. But what happened after that with text speak is that it became a way of um, coding your speech so that the adults didn't understand it. And so
Mm.
we have these two concepts in linguistics called convergence and divergence. And exactly as they sound, convergence is where you move towards the language spoken by the people around you, and divergence where you move away from the language that people speak around you. And particularly if there's prestige attached to a certain language type, you have upward convergence where you speak more like the people with more prestige, so you posh up basically, and then you'll have kind of like downwards convergence. So if you are from that kind of posher group and you are trying to identify with the ruffians, then you will go downward convergence. And a lot of teachers do this with the kids in their classes and should rightly be laughed at for it. But you can also have upwards and
Hello,
downwards.
fellow kids.
Yeah.
Hello, yeah. I think they put the baseball cap on backwards, which hasn't been done by young people in about 20 years. But
No.
yeah, it's
But
an
with the
interesting one
purpose
though.
of trying to seem approachable and
Mm,
trying to seem relatable
yeah,
to the kids.
exactly. So it's
Misguided, perhaps, but
yeah, totally
Mm.
understandable approach. Execution, not so
But isn't
good.
this more less necessarily about power and more about kind of connection? You know, like
Mm,
human beings, we're naturally kind of social creatures. You want to fit in. You want to connect. You don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable, like bowling in with your RP kind of like heightened tones or whatever it
mm,
might be, or in the other direction. So you kind of um you allow yourself, you push yourself to speak in a certain way to kind of maintain social cohesion, right?
Mm.
In a way, it's kind
Yeah.
of like, um, which I guess people could argue, well, that's because there is inherently a power element to it, which yeah, I
Yeah.
can totally see. I just think that like, I think that people are fascinated with the others,
Mm.
and we're curious about the way that other people speak, and we often pick up things from other people. We're like, oh, that sounds, that's cool, particularly when
Mm.
you're younger and you're like, you want to, yeah, maybe you want to separate yourself from your parents and not speak
Yeah.
like they do, and kind of
But that's the thing,
be
because
your own person.
yeah, but that's exactly the thing, isn't it? Because it is about connection with a specific group. But when you connect with a specific group, you're also rejecting another group,
Yeah.
assuming that there
Mm.
is a mix of groups in a certain context. And so you have to make a decision, whether kind of conscious or subconscious or indeed unconscious, a decision gets made about whether you're going to converge or diverge or stay the same. And where does
Mm.
authenticity come into it? What is your true voice? And all of that
Mhm.
stuff is massively complex and fascinating, I think. Um, but I guess to kind of um, come back to this idea of prescriptivism as a kind of as a movement where we go, this is the correct way to speak. Eleanor, you mentioned earlier these 17th century grammarians, as they called themselves. What did you kind of find out about them, or what was your kind of your general feeling about the grammarians?
Well, I was sort of looking into how these rules sort of came about, and I think what a lot of students don't realize is that for a long time, English as well as other languages wasn't standardized,
Mm,
and that spelling, and you can see this if you've seen a front page, for example, of one of Shakespeare's plays,
mm,
the tragedy, IE, at the
mm,
end,
mm,
and lots of sort of odd spellings because there weren't necessarily rules about it in a broad way. I think
mm.
that there were some conventions, and certainly if you knew Latin or Greek, there were some expectations, but spelling itself wasn't.
Yeah.
And then sort of with the advent of the printing press and everything,
Hmm.
because then a machine was creating this and it was being widely produced, then grammar became more standard, and these sort of books, or chapbooks, would come out in terms of guidance,
Yeah.
and it did seem to be linked to kind of the understanding that the person reading this book would want to access those fields of power that correctness would give
Mm.
them, in terms of this is how you're expected to streak, this is how a good person or a good Christian, and I'm using that good in huge quotations, of course, um, and how this sort of was used to kind of guide people towards a certain way of speaking and writing,
Yeah.
that I think was interestingly sort of parallel slash concurrent with rising literacy rates, which meant
Yeah.
that all of a sudden one group was telling a lot of people how they were expected to speak and were being sort of the guardians of that knowledge. And guardian again
Yeah.
with an asterisk because
Yeah. But they were
who gave them
entirely
the right?
self-appointed. These
Exactly.
these men, and it was men, were entirely
Exactly.
self-appointed, and they would their kind of rationale would either be based on Latin, based on kind of inflected languages, and English is much more syntactic than inflected. What that means is we rely more on word order for meaning than we rely on endings for meaning. We have a combination of both, but we're much more syntactic. And so when they try and apply Latin rules to English, they came up with these really bizarre systems that don't make any sense in English. And then hence kind of the splitting of the infinitive. Like, they are two words, we should split them occasionally because it has a nicer rhythm and a sense of emphasis. And all of their justifications were either with reference to Latin, or they would just pull something out of their backsides, like it's more perspicacious, and they'll go and like, this sounds more natural, and it doesn't sound remotely natural, of course. And so they're
But
entirely self-appointed.
over time it would, wouldn't it?
Mm. And that's exactly what happened.
And
So
so
these
isn't this
random
more a
rules.
case? Isn't this more a case of like, you could see it from the other side, could you not? That
Mm.
by codifying everything and putting it all into order, it therefore becomes easier to learn.
Mm.
And because it becomes easier to learn, you can teach it en masse. And if you can teach it en masse, then more people can eventually take part in it.
Yeah, and this is a
Because it's
huge
not,
advantage, right?
yeah, and yeah, you could. It's like you can think of any of other things that have been standardized, like the C major scale, or in music, taking away atonal musical sounds out of that kind of thing and just having it in this sort of 12, divisions, or
Mm.
GMT, defining like one single point as the point
Standard
zero
time.
for standard time,
Yeah.
or any one of these kind of standardizations, which on the one hand, yeah, absolutely, someone just comes along and says, right, I am saying that this is the thing.
Yeah.
And there's some discussions to be had about like who makes that decision. And from what you guys are saying, it seems to just been like arbitrary and
Yeah.
and
I'll do
yeah,
it.
we'll do it.
Hold my beer.
Um, but then the other side of things is once you've done that, yeah, you can start to figure out ways to teach it, and
Mm.
ways, and figure out ways for people to all come on board in your direction.
Yeah. But
Um,
the question then I think becomes what did people do before standardization came along? Did people struggle to communicate? Did people struggle to learn? And when it comes to language, the answer is no,
mm,
because language kind of came into existence pretty naturally. It seems to be a lot of anthropologists have argued it's one of the things that's inherent to being human. Um,
Mm.
and obviously there's a lot of kind of ableist questions to deal with there, but just as a kind of general understanding, it's one of the things that's pretty uniquely human is our kind of internalized grammar and ability to learn and acquire language to kind of great complexity, um, and without um, what teachers are doing, you could argue, because you're absolutely right to say that if we have a formal way, then we have a formal way of teaching, and we make it easier to kind of go, well, I can give you an actual answer to this question. But where's that sound coming from?
we've got a new
Sorry,
fourth
some
member
background.
of the podcast,
Incredible.
Mumble,
But
the mumbler.
you could argue, couldn't you, that what teachers are really doing is teaching students the acceptable, prestigious, right way to speak in order to access those things in society.
Yeah,
And the question then, off the back of that, is
but why shouldn't they
this is
be?
yeah.
Why shouldn't they
So
have?
this
Why
is
shouldn't they
great
have that?
for this is great for kind of social mobility, but on the other hand,
Mm.
more broadly, the concept of social mobility shouldn't exist. You shouldn't have to be educated in a very specific manner of speaking to be respected and be able to access those things. That should be on merit, or indeed the fact that you are a fellow human being. And so there's kind of like
Agree.
there's a lot of I think criticism to be had of that kind of concept, even though it's one we talked about earlier as obviously a good thing pragmatically for the individual to be able to access this. The question is just, should those power structures exist in the first place, right?
Mm,
Agreed. And looking back when I was doing a little bit of research for this
Mm.
pod, the motivations for prescriptivism vary quite a lot. So consistency, meaning, um, clarity, all of those things are absolutely listed as reasons for prescriptivism, but
Mm.
also nationalism and linguistic purism also come up as some. So it's that kind of stickiness of, yes, there are some very good reasons why we need a standard way of
Mm.
communicating if communicating is what we're intending to do and being clear on one side to another. But then also these ideas of like Louis, you were saying, of access and the fact that these are kept rules that
Mm.
in a way that require social mobility, and looking at the broader, should that be necessary? Um, and this maybe ties into something that we were talking about just before we started, which was about the fact that a group of linguists are trying to address this kind of broader strokes by trying to add within the Equality Act review accent-based discrimination as an accent as a protected quality into legislation
Mm.
as well.
Mm.
And
So
this,
what would that look like? Just for those who don't understand the concept of protected characteristics, what would that look like?
well, this is coming from Dr. Dominic Watt from the University of York, who's leading this kind of um, movement to promote accent diversity and to try and kind of within the UK make accents all sort of equally valid in power and accepted. This may trickle down to things like exam boards and in the next 10 or 15 years interrogating
Mm.
what standard English looks like in or why that phrasing is being used, or having a glossary, as we said from the start, of what that means
Yeah.
on exam boards. But it would mean that someone couldn't be discriminated against or penalized for having a different accent, which
But would
would
that be
be
in like in their spoken language?
currently. It seems a little bit that this is a movement still in its first stages of
Mm.
sort of defining what that would even look like in society, and what discrimination on accent looks like now in the UK. But just thinking about the future and how this could really become kind of another way that we talk about power and access in society, I think is
Mm.
really, really interesting.
Mm. I mean, I guess even this comes down to like, you know, we're English teachers, right? So when we're reading to our students, you know, we're trying to bring the texts alive, right? Is it appropriate? You know, there's this kind of like, what accents is it appropriate to do? You know, like for a teacher to speak in. You know, is it, if I'm doing Macbeth, you know, is it appropriate for me to put on a Scottish accent? Right? We'll find even in our lessons here at my Headspace when we're live streaming, kids are obsessed with you doing accents, you know,
Yeah.
and
They are.
they're like throwing every accent at you. Can
Mm.
you do an Indian accent? Can you do a
Mm.
Russian accent? Can
Mm.
you do Nigerian? Can you do Scottish? Can you do, you know, all these ones? And it's kind of like, well, firstly, short answer is no.
Not very
For
good.
We're busy.
yeah,
Busy
but
reading.
there is that thing, isn't there? Like, you know, what is it appropriate to do, taking power structures into consideration?
Mm.
Generally, you know, it seems that if you're putting on a bad French accent, that's okay, you know, like for whatever reason.
Mm.
But there are some that are not. I guess it also comes down to like, are you actually, you know, are you doing a good one? And the short answer is normally no, you're not. Even if you think it sounds like you are, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's just like kids don't want to hear you just reading in your day-to-day voice. They want you
Mm.
to kind of bring it to life, but where does it start to become problematic, I guess?
Yeah. And
Mm.
this is kind of a huge one, isn't it? Because um, most of it does come down, like when you often have an kind of inherent sense of what is an appropriate accent or impression to do and what isn't.
Mm,
And when you interrogate it, usually it's it seems that it's okay to do the accent of a fellow colonizer, or another member of Europe, but it becomes much less acceptable to do the accent of uh, someone historically colonized or oppressed by people with
mm.
your accent and your appearance,
Mm.
and a lot. So like you can't.
But
There's
kids don't understand this.
no, there's centuries of
They don't get
Yeah,
it.
it
history.
all comes back to power,
It
Yeah,
does. It all
yeah.
comes
doesn't
They
back.
it?
don't.
It
Yeah.
always does. Yeah.
And
Um.
it's like that's like too much of a conversation to probably get into today, but it's like
Mm,
for to really explain to a class of potentially 300 kids,
mm,
you know, here, why I'm not going to do that. It's going to take up too much time.
yeah.
Um, but I would like to see, I mean, what I would really like to see on, for example, on an exam board, when it comes to written styles is, yeah, just kind of more celebration of and more, I guess, acceptance really of different voices,
Mm.
right? I mean, it's not the best poem, and has come under a lot of kind of conversation, but obviously, you know, they study checking out me history. A lot of
Mm.
students do, or if
Yeah.
they're doing love and relationships, sing song.
Yeah.
Those are two poems that kind of take their dialects and turn them into poetry. You know, with still with you know still in English,
Yeah.
but like in their own versions. And yeah, my feeling would be that if a student wrote in that style for their language paper 1 question 5, that they'd be punished for that in some. I mean, punishment is
Heavily
a strong word, but
penalized.
but they would be marked down,
Mm.
right? Because they're not approaching. Now that seems to me incongruous. You can't celebrate that in poetry
Mm.
and then punish it in prose, in their writing, in their prose writing,
Yeah.
right? So I suppose an
It's
example would
tricky,
say,
isn't
listen, buddy, you know, we have 500,000 question 5s come in every single year, and we have to standardize some things,
Yeah.
but surely in the long term, you know, if we're going to break away from this kind of quite stifled and stale approach,
Mm.
that there has to be some, yeah, there has to be a kind of change. So I don't know what you
Yeah.
guys think of that.
Well, I think media, popular media, is the way, because if we pop back 7 or 8 centuries, if you'll join me, um, for a minute, we in this country, we English didn't really exist in the so-called Middle Ages. We had um, what we have Latin, and that was the language spoken and written in by the clergy mostly. So those religious figures who had power at the time. And we had kind of Norman French because of the Norman conquest, and that was the language of the elites. And then what we had, the third language that we had, was what was known as the vernacular, and the vernacular was this kind of this slangy version that took bits of the Norman French, bits of the Latin, and kind of jammed it into the Anglo-Saxon that was spoken, this kind of Germanic language that was spoken in this country before those conquests. And it was the language of the common man. And nobody would write in the vernacular until this chap called Chaucer came along. Okay, and Geoffrey Chaucer was an immensely respected poet, had a lot of power, had a lot of influence, and he chose to write in the vernacular. He chose to write in the language of the common man rather than the language of the elites, and therefore everyone was now reading this high art, this high literature. If we ignore the fact that the Canterbury Tales was mostly bawdiness and fart jokes, this was high literature that he was writing in the vernacular. And what it did is it I guess, set the blueprint for what you're saying, Alex, which is kind of this seismic shift in the prestige associated with more diverse and more lower class language use and types of English. And so, what does the modern equivalent of that look like? Well, it needs to be influential public figures not being ashamed to speak and write in a uh, in something other than standard English and receive pronunciation, right?
Mm.
Um, so I mean, who's it going to be, and how can that have a broad enough impact on society? Does it have to be the king? Does it have to be a prime minister? Um, who is that influential figure, and how do they get that out there? I mean, I would love to say that the way is poetry. You know, my heart says that the way is poetry, but realistically, about 3 people around the country are reading poetry outside of the outside of English classrooms, so probably not.
We're just waiting for the right poet. We're waiting for the Chaucer.
Yeah, we're waiting for our next Chaucer. I mean, I guess
That's it.
I guess artists, as in singers, songwriters, rappers, they're doing a lot. They are carrying that burden. They are the modern Chaucers. Obviously, it's a much more saturated market, but I mean, if you look at the influence that hip hop, the English used in hip hop has influenced the way that people in our inner city schools, for example, are speaking, then you've got evidence of that finding its way, and it just needs to be something more prestigious that the stuffy adults can recognize as good as well. And that's where the difficulty comes up.
Nice.
So in conclusion, it's complicated. So I think maybe
Rules
we
are made
just
to be broken.
rules are made to be broken, and I think it might be worth just ending with an interesting note on the opposite of prescriptivism, which is descriptivism. And most linguists fall into this category. And what they say about language is that language belongs to the people. People make language by using it. You talk, you develop your own systems, and then what linguists should be doing, what these authority figures should be doing, is describing it, not prescribing it, going, this is how language is used. And indeed, that's what dictionaries were originally for. So if we say, well, that's not in the dictionary, therefore it doesn't exist. A dictionary is a record of language as it is used by the people. And I think if we could apply the same thing to style guides and correct English rather than just spelling and definitions, then we might be a little bit closer to having a kind of a more progressive approach to language. If we could describe this is how English is used, that is good, that is valid, and then publish things based on what is used, and then update it as language changes, because it changes naturally. It doesn't change off the back of authority figures.
And I think we're starting to see that with the sort of the word of the year and the new additions to the dictionaries every year.
Yeah.
That language that the teenagers and the young people of 10 years ago is now sort of codified in the dictionary. And so it is an ongoing process, and will become more and more valid, the language, as we keep going and moving through time.
Language for the people, hey?
That's right. Egalitarian
That's
language.
something we can get behind. Amazing.
Great.
Well, what an interesting conversation. And I think we've managed to fit it all into just under an hour. Well done, us. Obviously, there are a million more directions that we could go with this, but I think it's really a good place to start. And hopefully, you as students listening can get an insight into the things that have to go through our heads as English teachers who are, we love language. We talk and think about language all the time. We don't want to put it into this tight box of what is acceptable and high class. We want to recognize it all. But those gosh darn exam boards, they insist on prescribing language. And those are some of the reasons why. So thank you both.
Cheers.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next time with Just English Talks. Bye.
Bye.